guys, welcome back to HRG TV, and today we've got this 2024 Bronco Sport non-badlands getting a 2.5-inch lift kit from HRG Offroad. And if you are interested in this lift kit, check out the link in the description below. And this is going to be the full installation start to finish on this job, so stay tuned, it's going to be a good one. All right, we're going to start off the installation by actually removing the battery. You do have to get the battery out to access bolts that are underneath it. Go ahead and pull your positive negative terminals off. There's a bracket that holds the battery down. That'll have to come out. And then the harnesses that go to the battery are actually attached to that bracket, so you'll have to pop those off to get the harnesses moved out of the way to get the battery out. Now, the next thing you gotta do is disconnect the air intake temperature sensor and take that air intake box cover off. Actually, you can just take the entire air box out as one piece. You just have to unhook the intake from the engine, and then there's a couple of clips on the front of radiator support that hold that whole piece in. So you just unclip those, and that whole thing just comes out as one big piece.
Okay, this comes as one assembly.
Now you also have to get the tray out as well. Again, there's bolts underneath you have to access. Support the engine and transmission with a jack, and as you can see, the 1.5 engine has a plastic oil pan, which is not good. And the next thing you're going to do is pull the mud guards off of the fender liners. That whole fender liner has to be pulled back because there is a bracket underneath that connects the frame rails to the bumper and also to the intercooler. So you have to pull all that out. Passenger side is easy to access. You just reach in, and as you can see here, there's two nuts that hold that bracket. I'm not sure what the technical term for these is, but we call them S brackets, and this is the passenger side one. The driver's side one is identical, but mirror image, and it is very difficult to reach, which you'll see in a minute. Unfortunately, on the driver's side, there's a control module that you have to move. So again, you're pulling the fender liner out of the way. The module itself is held in by a couple bolts, and you also have to take the bracket that holds the module in out of the way so that you can reach the bolts behind it. Now, I get that when you're talking about removing a computer module, it does seem a little bit intimidating at first, but remember, you're not going to actually unplug this module. You just need to move it out of the way so you can access some more bolts. My advice would be to take pictures along the way and just keep track of all the hardware and where it goes so that it'll go right back together again. Now, once you've gotten the module out of the way, there's going to be two more nuts on the driver's side holding that bar underneath the bumper in place. You're going to take those two out, as well as the bracket that holds the intercooler to that bar. Now, the kit comes with two longer brackets that are going to replace those that you've taken off of the intercooler. Unfortunately, I don't have a video of putting those back in, but it's easy to tell where they go. Just put them in place of the factory ones. They are shaped exactly the same. They're just an inch longer. Now that we've got that crossbar out of the way, we can remove the two bolts that are at the frontmost part of the subframe. There's a couple of small bolts there. There are two bolts underneath each fender. You can identify them because they have a sort of a star washer on them. We're going to go ahead and take those out, and we're going to replace those bolts with the two new ones that come with the kit. And we're not going to thread them in all the way, just temporarily. They're going to hold the subframe in place when we lower it so it doesn't get out of alignment, and we will tighten those later on. Now, the next thing we're going to do is take off the felt covers. Now, this one already has the driver's side removed, but they're the same process. And you will have to remove these brackets. There's a couple bolts in each side. These are like stiffener brackets for the subframe. So all the bolts have to come out of those. And then you're going to get to the two main subframe bolts. These are the big bolts that hold the subframe to the vehicle. We're going to take those out. And again, we're going to replace them one at a time with the new bolts that come with the kit, just temporarily, so it keeps everything in line. Now, as you can see, this side has dropped and gives us room to put our spacer in. And we're going to go ahead and put our new bolt in there And at this point, we can go ahead and tighten it up and secure it in place. Now, we did have to maneuver the subframe around a little bit to prevent cross-threading the bolts. Now that you've got the main bolts in place, we're going to go ahead and put the other smaller bolts into these support brackets before we tighten everything up. So there's a couple more aluminum spacers you're going to put in between the bracket and the body, and 2 more bolts that come with the kit on each side for those brackets. And once you get all of that lined up, we can go ahead and tighten all of those bolts and move on to the next step. And at that point, you can go ahead and reinstall all of the felt covers. And once you're done putting all the screws back into the felt pieces, we're going to move back to the front of the subframe where that small bolt was, and we're going to place an aluminum spacer between the subframe and the body there and secure it with bolts that come with the kit. And from there, we're going to move to the middle bolt, which is the one that had the star washer on it. Then you're going to place another aluminum spacer between the subframe and the body there. And we're going to pass that bolt through a bracket that is labeled L and R. Those are the ABS wire relocation brackets. It is important that the left side goes on the driver's side of the car and the right side goes on the passenger side of the car. And make sure they're oriented as you see them in this video. Next, we're going to take the 4 large bolts that hold the transmission bracket to the transmission case, and we're going to replace 2 of those with bolts that come with the kit. And that is, again, to keep the transmission in line when we lower it. Next, we're going to move over to the passenger side engine brackets. There are 4 bolts that hold the bracket to the engine block, and these are actually studs. So you're going to take the 4 nuts off and then back the studs out using an 8mm socket. You don't need a special tool to take these out, and they do just come right out. And again, we're going to replace these with longer bolts that come with the kit, and you're going to place spacers in between that bracket in the engine block and then put the bolts back in. And once you get the bolts and spacers mounted in the driver's side engine bracket, we're going to move back over to the passenger side with the transmission bracket and do the same thing there. Now you can use your floor jack to lower the engine just enough to get the spacers in between those mounting brackets and the transmission case. As you can see, just put 4 of those spacers in between and put the bolts back in place. Now from here, you're basically going to be reinstalling everything that you took out previously with your battery mounting bracket, battery tray, and of course the battery itself. Just do all this in reverse order of your removal. Make sure you don't leave any hardware out. On a side note, all the hardware on this one looks okay, but on my Bronco Sport, which is a Badlands, and was in the video of the Badlands 2.5-inch installation, all the hardware was rusty because the battery was actually leaking acid. So it's a good time right now to check to make sure that there isn't no acid leaking out of your battery, because it will rust all these bolts. And now that the battery's reconnected, you can move on to installing the air box. Basically, it again is in reverse order. Don't forget to hook up your air intake temperature sensor. That's that little sensor on the side there. And just place the plastic clips right back in place where they were. And then we can move on to the next step. At this point, we're going to go ahead and reinstall that control module. Now remember, during this installation, you do not have to unplug that module, but you basically just put all of the harnesses back in place and put the bolts and nuts back in place like they were.
How does... Aha. Okay.
Now once that's done, you can go ahead and move on to reinstalling the fender liner.
The next day.
So what we got to do here is basically pull the fender liner down into position where it was before on this subframe. Pull it through, and your piece of felt that they call a skid plate goes over top of it like this. and just get your screws started. I would recommend just getting them started. I wouldn't tighten them up until you have them all in, because you're gonna have to be doing some adjusting as you go. So basically, we're just gonna get these started. And then we've got one right here. Now, if you've got this front mud flat thing, that's gonna go on there as well. So poke that through like this, and then gonna be threading this back through, back into that hole there. Just tighten it up a little ways. Okay, we're not gonna tighten it all up all the way just yet. Back here, you've got 2 more screws that hold this on there. I want you guys to realize that the way this subframe fits inside this bumper, when you pull the subframe down, it wants to pull this bottom edge of the bumper down with it. So what you guys could do, if you wanted a slightly better fitment on all this stuff, you could actually cut a relief in the side of this plastic right here, because you can see where the subframe's coming down. I didn't want to cut this one because I didn't think it necessarily had to be cut. But like I said, if you wanted to get a little bit more room, you could just notch it right there and just remove this little corner right here. And that would allow this to have a little bit more play, so to speak. Lube techs aren't gonna like this, I can already tell you, but it is what it is. Basically, what I'm gonna show you is the order of putting all the hardware in, because it's gonna be pulled a little bit. If you wanted to give it a little bit more slack, you could actually re-drill these. I don't think we're gonna need to do that, but if you re-drilled new holes like back here for these screws and pulled it back a little bit, I think everything else would be a little easier to assemble, but we're not gonna do that. I'm gonna try to do this with as little modification to the car as possible. In this case, you just have to modify the method of putting this on versus cutting any pieces of plastic or anything. Now that we've got the skid plate attached at the front, we're gonna attach all the rest of the screws at the back. And this again is gonna take doing a little bit of pulling. There's your hole, basically right there. You're gonna get that in. And then again, I would probably leave everything loose until it's all done. So just to make it a little easier for everything to fit. But as you can see, we're still able to get all the screws in. I would highly recommend the HRG skid plate if you are gonna take these off-road, because it actually attaches to the subframe with 6 bolts. This isn't gonna do much for you. And there you have it. Again, now that everything is attached with the felt, we're gonna put those 2 screws back in. Right through. And then this one's gonna be a little bit of a nuisance, but I think we can get it in there. Just gotta get your hand inside there and grab a hold of the felt and position it where it needs to go. Find the screw hole. This one's hard to see without light. There it goes. That's it. Now, again, we installed this entire lift kit and all the screws that hold this in without having to cut anything. The only thing I'm gonna say we are gonna have to cut is we're gonna have to mount this fender liner right about there. So what we'll do is pop a hole in here right next to this, and then that way we can put our little plastic clip back in that'll hold that from being loose there. There you go. So you can just put your plastic piece back in. Now that's held in place.
Okay.
You're not gonna mushroom the head. Now, since this video was filmed, we actually changed these spacers just a little bit. We added an L and an R so you can tell which side is driver's and passenger side. And of course, L is for driver's side on US models. So look for the L on your spacer, and that goes on the driver's side. Now, another thing that we changed on this lift kit was the sway bar end links. As you can see, these are used. These were actually just a test fit. The ones that we have for this kit are actually custom made just for us, and they're basically exactly the same as a factory sway bar end link, except they're just a little bit shorter. All right, so if you look here, we've already done our brake line spacer, but we're still a little bit snug up here. So what I do is use a adjustable wrench, and we're just going to pull this mount down and give that a little bit more of a favorable angle. So that's going to get it where it's not quite so in so much of a bind. There you go. Definitely an improvement. And this has still got plenty of movement here, so we haven't bound anything up, but this basically just gives this a little bit more free movement and makes it where your brake lines don't have an issue. The next thing we're going to do is create a little bit of clearance on the firewall for the steering coupler. That is the universal joint that connects your steering column to the steering rack. Now, obviously, since we've lowered the subframe, the steering column is in slightly a different position, but lucky for us, it is a universal joint, so you can move it around and it doesn't affect how it connects or how it performs at all. We just need to create a little bit of clearance around it, and you can do this one of two ways. As you can see here, we're just using a screwdriver to kind of bend the metal a little bit. You can also use a body saw to cut a small notch right where it makes contact to eliminate that interference, and then you're pretty much good to go after that. All right, next we're going to move on to the rear subframe installation. And again, same concept as the front. We're only going to take one bolt out completely at a time. You're going to want to always have at least 3 bolts in there. Now, it might be a little bit safer to go ahead and support the rear subframe with either a floor jack or, in our case, a screw jack, so you can control the descent of the subframe so it doesn't just fall. But basically, all you have to do then is replace each one of those bolts with the new ones that come with the kit and place your spacer in between the subframe and the body. And once all 4 of those are done, you can just go ahead and tighten all 4 bolts back up. It's actually a super easy job.
I had those on upside down and they were extremely loose, and I'm like, that's not supposed to be like that. And then after I sent him to go get you, I realized, wait, I put those on upside down.
Yeah, you'll have that.
There is a plastic push pin up on this side of this felt. It would probably be a good idea to remove this before you lift it or put a jack underneath it.
I don't think it can be overstated how important it is to be careful with these trailing arm bolts because they are very, very easy to cross thread. So always make sure to thread these in by hand and maneuver them around if you need to with a pry bar so that you get a clean start on the threads before you impact them in. Now, when you place the spring back into this rubber isolator, you want to make sure the end of the coil butts up against the little stopper that's built into that rubber piece. And the same thing goes for the bottom. You're going to need to rotate the spring until the end of the coil touches the relief cut in the lower rubber isolator. All right, that pretty much wraps it up for the installation. I wanted to talk about tire sizes real quick. You've got a 17-inch wheel typically, so it's a 245/65/17. If you have an 18-inch wheel, it's a 245/60/18. Now, on this kit, you can go a little bit bigger. You can go with a 245/70 on a 17-inch wheel and a 245/65 on an 18-inch wheel. Now, keep in mind that is the maximum tire size you can do on these, and there may actually be additional modifications needed to get those to fit because not all tires are created equal. Some tires run big for a given size. So keep that in mind. And with that said, I appreciate you guys watching all the way to the end, and I will see you in the next video.